Hi there. I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for joining me for another Theory of Change live episode. We've got a great show for you today, as always, and just wanted to remind everybody that Theory of Change is part of the Flux Media Network, so please visit us at flux.community. And you can also go to theoryofchange.show and get the episode archives directly on the Flux website. So we've got transcripts and audio and video of all the episodes out there. And if you are a member of our Flux Patreon, you can have access to all the transcripts. It takes a lot of time to produce those transcripts, so we need your help to do that. And we need your help to produce in-depth podcasts and articles about larger trends in American politics, religion, media, and technology. So please do support us with that. That's patreon.com/discoverflux. All right. So we're going to get into the topic here for today after that little announcement. Today, June 24th, 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court ignored decades of settled precedent about abortion access and women's health care in a sweeping decision that rolled back the court's 1973 decision Roe v. Wade. The new ruling in Dobbs v. Jackson's Women's Health Organization is the culmination of decades of anti-abortion activism. But it's also part of something even bigger than that. Clarence Thomas, one of the reactionary justices who joined in today's 6-3 ruling, signaled in a concurring opinion that he aims to overturn the Supreme Court's decisions protecting the rights to contraception, private consensual sex acts, and the right for people to marry someone else of the same sex. Quote, "We have a duty to correct the error established in those precedents," Thomas wrote. "Accordingly, we should eliminate it from our jurisprudence at the earliest opportunity." End of quote. No other justices formally signed on to Thomas's opinion, but it's critical to note that the Dobbs ruling and all of the other recent SCOTUS decisions are part of a much larger political and legal movement that is extremely radical and also extremely influential. Since the rise of Donald Trump, a lot of people have become aware of right-wing extremism, but what many people don't know is that the radical right is actually far more powerful in the Republican Party. Joining me to discuss this is David Neiwert. He is a senior staff writer at Daily Kos and also the author of a number of books, including Alt America. Thank you for being here, David. And he's also I stepped on you there. Joining me to discuss this is David Neiwert. He's a senior staff writer at Daily Kos and also the author of a number of books, including Alt America and Red Pill, Blue Pill. He's also a longtime analyst for the Southern Poverty Law Center. Thanks for being here.
Pleasure.
All right. Well, so as I said, this ruling today and the rulings that we've been seeing in the recent Supreme Court terms, they're part of something a lot bigger that I think a lot of people haven't paid a lot of attention to. And since Trump came along, there has been some focus on what Joe Biden is now calling ultra MAGA. But the reality is that ultra MAGA really isn't that different from the Republicans who have been controlling the Republican Party for the past several decades. Isn't that right?
No, that's right. I mean, ultra MAGA is the Tea Party, is the Patriot movement. I mean, this has been going on. This radicalization of the mainstream right's been a 3-decade-long process. And, Trump was just its apotheosis. He was just its culmination, its realization. But this movement had been building for quite a long time. And the interesting thing about it was certainly one of the things about Trump was that he came to represent a sort of unifying figure for a lot of different sectors of the radical right, all of whom have been agitating for the overturning of Roe versus Wade, but frequently for entirely different reasons. White nationalists and white supremacists wanted overturned for entirely different reasons than Christian nationalists do, but they all wanted it overturned. And I would argue that in a lot of regards, the Christian nationalist motives are fundamentally misogynist as well. But in the white nationalist neo-Nazi world, no, there's a straight up control of women, very deeply misogynist worldviews. And, for Christian nationalists, it was somewhat tempered by and piety with which they wrapped everything,
Hmm.
particularly their reliance on biblical scripture and
Hmm.
moral outrage, which is really a lot of what the Christian nationalist component was. And let's be clear, I mean, the Federalist Society, which formed this Supreme Court, is deeply tied to the Christian nationalist movement.
Yeah. Well, actually, can you, yeah, do you mind just give a little overview of what the Federalist Society is for those people who don't know what that is?
Sure. Well, the Federalist Society is this organization based in Washington that, since really, I think the 1980s, has been working to put very arch conservatives on, not just through the federal court system, including obviously the Supreme Court, and they have this. They argue that they basically promote this idea of originalism, and for many years they were decrying activist judges, which oddly has gone away. I don't know why. They don't talk about activist judges anymore, do they? But this is
No, they don't.
that's the deal. And so, it was highly influential in Washington, particularly in Republican circles. Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, um, and Gorsuch are all members of the Federalist Society, and they were the Federalist Society's Leonard Leo was the guy who was telling Trump who to select. So basically, this is a Federalist Society court, and we're seeing the results.
Hmm. Yeah, and the Federalist Society, and you mentioned Leonard Leo. So it's basically, one of the biggest problems for the political left in the United States has been that it has become so utterly convergent with the academic world. And it basically has drastically inhibited them to understand the way that politics works for average people, because average people, of course, are not concerned with political theory. They're not concerned with legal theory. They don't know anything about substantive due process or legal formalism or originalism. Like, none of these things mean anything to a normal person.
Right.
And so, but basically there was this, and then at the same time, because they were so caught up in the that academic debates about whether Antonin Scalia or Clarence Thomas, they were talking about the merits of so-called originalism and textualism. But the
Right.
reality is those were never real. Like, they never believed in those things. And you
Right.
can see that in terms of, especially in regards to federalism, like with these recent
Right.
cases this week. So that today's ruling about abortion, saying that, well, it's a matter that should be left to the states. But then with regard to guns, well, that's a matter that should be protected nationally. So these are not a consistent approach to federalism,
No.
and certainly the idea that that the American founders had any sort of that their ideas regarding guns have any applicability to automatic weapons is absurd, and that they even contemplated is ridiculous. So, but basically,
Yeah.
they were so caught up in this conflated fake academic debate about right-wing supposed legal beliefs that they weren't paying attention that it's all political all the way down.
Yeah. Well, honestly, originalism always struck me as incredibly analogous to, as sort of a legal mirror of Christian fundamentalism. which basically asserts that the texts of whatever it is you're reading from, I mean, we get the same thing with the Patriot movement and the so-called constitutionalists, where they assert a specific meaning as being the only one possible for a specific text. And this, it obviously in, say, the Christian world, this, you can see the effect that what it actually does is it distorts the actual meaning of the faith in a way, because it makes it, what it actually does is it asserts that, the person who's doing the interpreting gets to tell everybody else what to believe.
Yeah, well, and it's about politics ultimately.
It does.
It's
a kind of assertion of power, but it's power over people's minds and beliefs. And you see the same thing with originalism, that they were able to claim that the founders wanted this and this and that for, say, the Second Amendment, which was actually in a lot of ways almost wholly a concoction of, they basically went searching for evidence to try to support the narrative that they wanted. And ultimately, what this means is that everything they do is very outcome oriented, because, which is why, you'll have them ruling against gun control because in one state, because we can't have states doing this, and yet they'll also rule against abortion rights.
Oh, actually, sorry, you got it. And playing going back there. Remember, repeat that if you could, so I can cut that on the audio. You're saying that they're outcome based.
Yeah. So being outcome based means that they're basically they're twisting those words to reach a specific outcome that they want. And you see this in religion, you see it in the law, you see it in various facets of life. But the religion and legal ones are the ones we're having to deal with right now. And yeah, it's a way of, it's really kind of a cynical form of manipulation of, like I said, people's ways of thinking and being. So and it's been very successful.
Yeah. Well, and actually, before we go on, I did want to. So, if you're watching on Twitter right now, please do retweet the show link. And actually, David, if you could retweet that, I sent you the link in our private chat.
Yes, I did already.
Oh no, that was for the announcement for the video stream.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Oh, no problem. So, so, but basically, there was just going back to the academicization of everything on the left, that there's this idea that because right-wing arguments are not very good intellectually or philosophically, that therefore they don't need to be paid attention to as a political matter. And of course, the reality is that their poorness, their low qualityness, their extreme nature makes them even more necessary to be paid attention to and to make the public aware of it. But that seems to be the opposite of what's happened both in the Democratic leadership, but also in terms of the media, and that you've experienced that as well, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, Matthew, I've been warning about the radicalization of the mainstream right since at least 2008 or 9. That was what my book, The Eliminationists, which was published in 2009, was about. And I was been regularly dismissed for 12, 14 years as an alarmist. So, all I've honestly been trying to do is just report what I see. And after a while, you just start tuning out the people who call you alarmist, because they're just, they're missing the boat. And honestly, after a while, I just started putting my head down and kept doing the work, because I knew what I was writing was accurate. And if people don't want to listen, that's on them. You
Yeah.
know,
Well, yeah, and the thing about it, from the media standpoint, that what we've the entire emergence of red America, blue America, um, it didn't have to be this way because and this was a strategy that was chosen by the Democratic elites, the Democratic leaders. And Howard
mhm.
Dean was one of the people when he became chairman of the Democratic National Committee. He started implementing this idea of a 50-state strategy
Yeah,
because he didn't want Republicans to have a free ride anywhere, and so he
yeah.
started doing that. But that was something that people started trying to dismantle. That you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, yeah. Well, honestly, I felt that the 50-state strategy had a lot to do with Obama's election in 2008 because it really did into and empower ordinary rural Democrats in ways that they'd been abandoned by Democratic Party beginning in the 80s because of their emphasis on finding mining the largest numbers of votes in the areas where the largest number of votes were available. Perfectly logical, but it also, in terms of the long term, it has really toxic consequences. And those toxic consequences is that you basically turn over all of these rural areas to the rule of not just Republicans, but as we can see now, the extreme right. I mean,
Hmm.
I'm from Idaho. My wife's family is from Montana, and I can tell you, and we still have family back there. I can tell you that it's just miserable in these rural areas now for anybody who is not just a diehard Republican, but diehard Trumpian with a "fuck Joe Biden" flag. That's and a Gadsden flag hanging from their uh, thing.
Hmm.
That's it's. I mean, the seep of patriot movement extremism into the rural Republican Party has been so powerful that I don't think it's possible to, you know, uh, explain to people because most people are resistant to actually understanding that that's a lot of what's happened. And
Yeah, well, and actually, Idaho. Sorry, just to step in
yeah,
real quick. That Idaho is a really great example of that because you've got the guy who is the governor named Brad Little, who is certainly not by any stretch of the not by any stretch of the matter a moderate Republican. This guy
right,
is a right wing Republican, but it wasn't enough for a lot
right.
of people in the state, and so he was challenged this year by his own lieutenant governor, whose name is Janice McGeechan, and she is a completely insane person. She literally tried to unilaterally repeal a number of his of his executive orders while he was on a trip outside the state. She did this repeatedly. She's famous for making a campaign ad featuring herself holding a gun and a Bible, just like an just like it was like the Christian equivalent of an Islamic terrorist holding up a gun and a Quran. And yeah, and
Yeah,
so like
well,
that's what the Republican right wants to be. And a
that's
lot of
yeah,
and a lot of people in the sort of apolitical center, they just see this stuff, and to them they just dismiss it as, well, McGeechan is a lunatic, she's crazy, it doesn't matter, I don't have to pay attention to her, she's just dumb. But
yeah.
that's not the story of the past 50 years, is it?
No, well, yeah, Jan went to my high school.
Oh,
And
wow.
she graduated from my high school.
Was she as crazy back
Seven
then?
years, 7 years. No, I didn't know her.
Oh,
She
okay.
graduated in 81. I was in 74. But yeah, we called her after that ad. Her nickname was McLaughlin Bible. But fortunately, she lost. I mean, that was the thing, is that Jan was very closely tied in, not just with the Patriots and the Ammon Bundy types, who had really been, you know, running rampant in the state for the previous year and a half. But she, late in the campaign, spoke to the Groypers, the white nationalist gathering of the America First people, the Nick Fuentes outfit down in Florida. And when the word of that got out, I think that pretty much killed her chances. I think, I mean, she lost pretty badly to Little, and so I thought that was a good sign. Nonetheless, the fact that she had such a viable campaign for such a long time was really a troubling sign. And in fact, there are still a number of very far right extremists within the Idaho legislature. And there are still a lot of people there who supported her. Yeah, and look next door in Wyoming, what's happened to Liz Cheney? I've never supported Liz Cheney for anything in my life, but I definitely am sympathetic to her now, and I think she's done a fine job with the January 6th committee. But so she sort of represents the last of the sane Republicans, but her own state is I think wins the Wyoming primary. I think in a month or two. I think they're going to vote her out. So
yeah, well, and the thing about this whole dynamic is that right-wing extremist movements, they have the kind of passion and dedication to keep persisting at this stuff for decades and decades, no matter how much they lose.
They never.
Whereas when you look at Twitter, whenever there is some court decision, you see all these people saying, "Oh, that's it. I'm leaving America. This is over. We became a fascist country yesterday, etc." And they're not understanding that this is a thing that took a long time to happen, and it can be reversed, because the reality is that most people are support abortion rights, and most people support the ability of people who are to marry someone of your own sex. These are things that have majority support, but what we need is an infrastructure of democracy. What we need is the development of that kind of passion and dedication for policies that benefit everyone. And right now, the Democratic Party leadership that's out there, they're all in their 80s basically, and in their minds, it seems like a lot of them have this sort of fictionalized version of the Republican Party, where there's people like Nelson Rockefeller out there that have power, and they don't.
It's like they watched way too many episodes of The West Wing. That's all I can say. It's like, yeah, it's a TVized version, and it's this mythical version of the bipartisanship of bygone era, right? Which did exist. I mean, there's no question that the whole atmosphere of cooperative bipartisanship that I grew up with in the 70s and 80s. I was one of my mentors in Idaho was Senator Frank Church, and he definitely worked across the aisles. I mean, he was one of his closest allies in dealing with the CIA was the Republican senator from Rhode Island, John Chafee. So, but the Chafee Republicans don't exist anymore, and but I think the Joe Bidens of the world want to believe they do.
Well, the Chafee Republicans exist in the voters,
yes,
but they don't exist among the politicians. And and there's this phrase, and quoting it has become a bit hackneyed, but this idea that the center cannot hold, from that poem by William Butler Yeats. And and that's true, because when you have this sort of compromising first mentality, it makes it so that you can, if your goal is to have compromise and to have bipartisanship, then you will, by definition, go with whatever side pushes the hardest. That position is what will prevail. And and so that's the concern that a lot of people who are, well, not in their 80s, have with the Democratic leadership, that they've fetishized bipartisanship for a long time. And to be fair, a lot they've learned to some degree, some of them have, about why the filibuster needs to be eliminated. But at the same time, you still have people like Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, but not just them. Sometimes you hear other people like Chris Coons talk about how the filibuster is good. And you have, and Barbara Buck, I mean, not Barbara, Dianne Feinstein has talked about the filibuster and why it's good. And of course, the reality is that, the filibuster has some value for that, but when it's abused and taken far beyond what it was originally intended to be,
no kidding.
Then you can't. It's not something. Institutions that are abused are not worth veneration.
Right. Basically. Well, when they made it possible for senators to invoke the filibuster routinely without having to actually stand up and give the speeches, which is something that happened in the late 80s and early 90s, totally transformed it into a cynical tool for cynical manipulators. Yeah. And that's what it has become. I mean, you just look at the charts of the use of the filibuster prior to 1980, and then how it just skyrocketed beginning in the 90s, and the Gingrich Congress and all those folks. The use, and then once Obama won election, its use became perfunctory. It used to be a rare exception. And also, I mean, I remember because I was working with church, that it used to be pretty common for legislation. It was rare to have to have 60 plus votes to pass legislation in the Senate. It was not a minority ruled body as it is now, because once you require those 60 votes instead of the 50-50, it's no longer majority rule.
Yeah,
it ceases to be majority rule.
Yeah, and the reality is that California, just by itself, has 40 million people, and just the structure of the Senate itself. California has only 2 senators. And Democrats, they should have realized that this is what was happening, and that the Senate was being abused. And so talking about, admitting other states or splitting up California. I mean, as somebody who lives in California, California is such a big state with so many concerns and so many different people.
It's its own nation.
Yeah, it is. But people, even as it is, it's so big that people don't really fully pay attention to state politics at all. Like, if you asked, I would bet money, if you asked the average Californian who the governor is, a lot of them wouldn't even know that. And if you ask them who the lieutenant governor is, well, they certainly wouldn't know that.
Draw a blank, yeah.
And so like splitting up California into other states, or admitting Puerto Rico, or there's or Guam, there's any number of things that they could have done and should have done in order to play. I mean, these rules of the Senate, seat allocation, they weren't secret. And the reality is that North Dakota, South Dakota, that was supposed to originally just be Dakota. But Republicans actually created those 2 states in order to give themselves more senators. That literally happened. And so these are the rules of the game. But Democratic Party leaders seem to be so
timid.
Well, they're timid, but they also venerate institutions that fundamentally are against them and are harmful to their beliefs. And but they and they don't seem to understand that, which is weird, because like when you look at the way that America works, when the United States works in other countries to help them try to establish some representative form of government, we never go for anything close to the American system of
Yeah.
this. We don't do that, and a huge part of that is, so especially in regards to the filibuster. So like one thing about the filibuster, that not only does it function to stop legislation, and that by definition favors right-wing viewpoints, but it also has protected the Republican Party from having its radicalism exposed to the public. So, in other words,
Yes.
these moments with the Supreme Court that we're seeing now, this is really the first time that a lot of people have had a direct insight into the radicalism of the Republican Party.
Right.
But the Republican Party has had extremely radical ideas for a long time, long before Trump. I mean, like the idea of getting rid of the Affordable Health Care Act. That they were pushing this long before Trump came along, before he thought about running for president, and they were
Yeah.
willing to directly remove healthcare from 15 million people, just take it away from them like that.
Yeah.
And they so but they were always protected from it by the filibuster, because Mitch McConnell was able to use it as sort of a, basically he protected the Republican Party using the filibuster by saying, oh well, see, look, we can't pass this insane vote here that would destroy us with the voters, so we're not going to do it. And so basically the public never knew fully what Republicans wanted, and what Republicans want is to basically repeal the New Deal, to repeal the sexual revolution, and to repeal the Great Society. They want to go
and
back
the
to the
civil rights
1920s.
movement, civil rights
And
movement as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
like this has nothing to do with Donald Trump.
No, that's right. That's right. This is about, I mean, returning America to the rule we had in 1905, where we were basically ruled by oligarchs in a society that turned citizens into functionally indentured servants. Um, I think it's hard for people to understand or to remember that in 1905, you did not have weekends. You did not have vacations. You were required to work between 60 and 80 hours a week, for which you got a mere pittance of the pay. And frequently you were required to work in systems where you wound up actually owing the company you worked for money at the end of the day for working for them. And that's
And
how
there were no workplace protections, safety
there,
regulations.
people died all the time in workplace fires and accidents. And the value of human life in these workplaces was nil. So we've forgotten all this. We've forgotten that was what life was like under the rule of oligarchs. And we're turning our country back over to these oligarchs again, because they're the ones who have been financing all of this radicalization of the extremist right. They're the ones who've been, it's oligarchs who have transformed what used to be a competitive free market media system, where there really was competition, an open competition of ideas, and a much more democratic approach to a much more open approach to journalism. Once corporations began snapping up media properties in the 1980s and transforming them, once media became entirely corporate owned, it totally transformed the shape and nature of the discourse in this country in ways that we can now see the consequences, where we've had one channel for the last 20 years, Fox News, that devotes all of its time, 24/7, to encouraging and advising its viewers on how to hate the other half of America that doesn't watch Fox News, how to hate their neighbors, how and why to hate their neighbors. And then we wonder why we're a divided nation, because we've had people getting coached on why and how to divide their nation, and it's all been predicated on false information, smears, and wildly distorted conspiracism. And not to mention, we just it was the foundation of Trump's presidency. And,
Hmm.
we were getting fed it beginning in the 1990s from Fox News and from Rush Limbaugh, and it's never stopped.
Yeah.
We've had Fox News playing on our military bases and indoctrinating our people on military bases with false information.
Yeah.
I don't think that should be going on. I look. It used to be when I started out in journalism, the adage was, the enemy isn't left or right. The enemy is bullshit. That's still true for me. But the problem is that when you have one party and its support system churning out a gigantic mountain of bullshit on the daily, whereas Democrats do bullshit too, and it's good to call them out on it. But oh my God, I mean the level and wildness of the sort of bullshit we've been getting from Democrats for the last 30 years has been it's so much that it's been it just overwhelms us. And I think that's been part of their tactic, is to just flood the field with shit.
Well, and Steve
the hell out
Bannon,
of everybody.
yeah, and Steve Bannon, Trump's consigliere, literally said that to someone.
Yes.
We want, and when you look at scholarship about fascism, and that is a common tactic that, and it's not just fascism per se, but like authoritarian rules. That is how it's predicated, because if nothing is true, then if nothing you see is true, then anything can be true.
And ultimately, people. One of the things that happens, of course, is when you ignore people from their bearings like this, they become fearful. And one of the things that happens when that the authoritarians do is they say, well, they present themselves as the anchor for which anchor of security, sort of anchor of information, and anchor of truth for them, because that he becomes the authoritarian leader and his minions become the font of whatever truth you need to know.
Yeah,
and that's how authoritarianism has always worked, and it doesn't matter whether it's left or right.
These are the tactics. Yeah. Well, and so this is what kind of goes back to the some of what they were saying, that that there's this idea that people they don't and a lot of it does go back to religious fundamentalism as well. So this fake news environment, this disinformation filled environment, if for until that came along, people who believed all the stories in the Bible were literally true, that God made the world in 7 days, 7,000 years, 6,000 years ago. I mean, these were ideas that are objectively not true, and like you can actually see that they're not true.
Yes.
But in a world in which you're pumping out all kinds of deliberate lies and false beliefs, basically people don't have to examine their beliefs, because there is no marketplace of ideas anymore. All there is, well, I believe this, and that's what I believe, and I have the right to believe it. And so it basically breaks down the distinction between informed opinion and ludicrous opinion. And it makes everything else possible, because and the media certainly played into that a lot, in terms of treating beliefs that were objectively false as if they had some sort of equivalency to beliefs that were not. And this isn't a matter of saying, well, I think the tax rate should be X, and I think the tax rate should be Y. It is a matter of saying, if we cut taxes, we'll get more revenue. Like, this idea is, you can literally prove that it's not true. All you have to do is look at history, and you can see that it's not true. But they never, they've never pushed this out to the American public doesn't know that Republican elites believe this. I mean, this obviously stupid idea. And they don't know that, the Supreme Court, that the Republicans who were on there, Barrett and Thomas, and these people, that they are literal biblical fundamentalists, who
Yeah, yeah,
don't believe that evolution is real. I mean, like, if you don't believe evolution is real, you really should have no contact with public policy, because you're stupid. You believe something so obviously dumb. But at the same time, they've coddled these right-wing beliefs over and over the decades and never really challenged them. Do you think that's right?
yeah. Well, if you if you laugh at them, they call it you're bigoted against Christians.
Hmm.
That's it's a pretty standard tactic. And
Even though, of
uh,
course, there's plenty of Christians that don't believe this stuff.
yeah, that's correct. Yeah, not only that, it's a lot of times it's Christians who are laughing at them. But
Yeah.
but
But yeah, I mean,
you know,
even, just forcing them to like, there has just been on the left just this complete disregard for, well, the battle of ideas is over. They showed they were dumb. So that's it. Let's
sure.
focus on other things.
Well, it's like Christopher Rufo and his just openness about how they don't care about the truthfulness of what they're saying about critical race theory and grooming and things like that. What they care about is that they are able to to get people to believe it. By you and open about how this is how we use our tactics. We get people to associate. You know, you get to associate things like learning about Japanese American internment with critical race theory, right?
Hmm.
Or if you, God forbid, should learn about the lynching era or the Tulsa massacre,
Hmm.
well, that's critical race theory.
Yeah.
It's just crazy. Um,
Yeah. Well, and Rufo, for those who don't know him, is this Republican consultant, and he literally and repeatedly just comes out with stuff and says, well, all right, so we're going to say that this is, this thing that's obviously false, and it doesn't matter that it's false, because this is helpful to us. So, like, I
yeah.
mean, those
And just
statements.
keep pumping it out. Just keep pumping it out. That's what he's
Yeah.
selling.
Yeah.
And you know
And
what? It works.
yeah. And
That's the
and
scary part.
yeah. But if you're a journalist and you're covering the subject of critical race theory in a school board debate or whatever,
Yeah.
you have an obligation to tell the public that this is where these ideas came from.
Yeah.
These are the people
Yeah.
who are doing it, because if you don't do it, you're failing the audience. And you're giving them a distorted picture of what's happening.
Well, I can tell you, if you're a reporter on pretty much any modern corporate-owned entity now, media entity now, you'd have an editor or a producer who wouldn't let you do that because
And why do you think they wouldn't?
because they're all afraid of being accused of liberal media bias. Yeah,
Hmm.
Limbaugh and Fox News, whose entire rise on debt was to combat liberal media bias, which had been, a talking point of conservatives all during the 80s and 90s, and particularly Limbaugh in the 90s. It became a fetish in the newsrooms that I worked in. Every single newsroom that I worked in had the bosses were concerned about being accused of, we don't want to be accused of liberal media bias. Which is why my work on domestic terrorism, which won a National Press Club award for MSNBC, by the way, upon which they probably shoved me to the back of the newsroom, which is when that was my signal to go retire from newsroom work and become a stay-at-home father, which is what I did for the next 5 years. So,
Hmm.
um,
Well, yeah. Well, so
so
let's maybe talk about some of your books then, that you have been
sure,
working on since then. So, your book, I think, that is pertinent to this discussion. I mentioned it earlier. Is called Alt America. Tell us about what that was and when did it come out?
That came out in October 2017, which is some like 2 months after Charlottesville, but of course it was in process well before Charlottesville. But unfortunately, I needed it out to be out at that August, and we'd had a number of delays getting it out. So it kind of got missed by October 2017, but it's done very well. Basically, it's a history of how we got here. It goes back more or less to the 90s. History of the radical right in America and how it's gained entree into the mainstream, how it's basically taken control of the Republican Party. And the title references one of the real features of all of this, which is that it um, one of the one of the innate parts of it we were just discussing. You know how authoritarianism induces people to believe in their own set of facts and have their own thing, but it ultimately creates an alternative reality for them, which I dubbed Ultimerica, where they they've constructed this whole universe built out of false facts, conspiracy theories, wild conjecture, and grotesque smears. That's what they work off of. That's what this belief system is, and that's what this worldview that they've developed is. And that's how they've operated for I would say at least since the late '90s, early 2000s. The New Gingrich era really had a lot to do with transforming the Republican Party into a party that no longer wanted to deal with facts and logic and reason, but was all about grabbing people on gut level narratives and seizing power through the most cynical means possible, and including the election of George Bush in 2000, which shouldn't have happened. Um, but that was, these things have been going on for quite some time, and uh, you know, the reality is that now we can really see how acute this sort of epistemological dysfunction is. That we actually have this whole segment of 70% of Republicans, more than 70% of Republicans believe that Biden was fraudulently elected, and that Trump had the election stolen from him without any evidence whatsoever, just their gut feeling, which you just referenced. You find people saying this. I mean, that was what Coy Griffin down in New Mexico said. Well, we may, when he was having this dispute over the counting of the ballots in his county in New Mexico, he said, well, and he was trying to have basically go for the what we call the fake elector strategy, and he acknowledged that yeah, well, it may not be factual, but I just believe it in my gut. I don't have any evidence, but I just know it that this is what happened. And
Yeah.
this is really widespread among Republican
Yeah.
true believers.
Oh yeah. Well, and Rudy Giuliani during the Rudy Giuliani, in the after Trump lost the 2020 election, and he was scrambling around trying to push this fake elector scheme, and they were saying it in Arizona, please just do this. We've got a lot of theories, but we don't have a lot of facts, and that's basically instrumental in shows you how they think. But this is a mentality that's been around for a long time. There was this right-wing writer named Stan Evans, whose full name was M. Stanton Evans. And one of the things, he used to joke for decades. He passed away, I believe, in like 2013 or so. He used to joke that I didn't like Nixon until Watergate. And that was not as much of a joke as it as it came out, because in fact that is what happened. So Richard Nixon, when he was at the bitter end, and the reason that he got to that point of having to be resigned from office was because there were enough Republicans who had coherent belief systems and were willing
Yeah.
to be passionate about them, and to do something more than just the raw pursuit of power. And so they were the reason that he was shown the door, Nixon. But by the end, the only people who were sticking to Nixon were the far right lunatics.
Yes.
And so that was what Stan Evans said in that regard was actually pretty meaningful and accurate of a description of how the radical right was in terms of how it saw politics back then and how they see them now. I mean, that we're at this point now where even so, the January 6th committee has been doing these hearings recently, and they've they've uncovered all kinds of documents and things like that. But they've also featured a lot of testimony from Republican elites talking about how they didn't believe that Trump had won. They believed that he'd lost and there was no evidence for it. And that this was, in the words of one of them, rubber room stuff. So crazy
Right.
material. But at the same time, they were still willing to vote for Donald Trump.
Oh
And
yeah. Yeah.
and so here's the thing, though, is that a lot of liberal or progressive or centrist left, whatever you want to call them, people on the center to the left spectrum, they've noted that these
Right.
Republicans who don't believe in Trump's lies will still vote for them, and
Right.
it's just more as look at that, those guys are dumb. But what it really shows is that these people are so fanatically committed to their anti-majority viewpoints that they're willing to elect someone they believe to be crazy.
Yeah, well, part of that has to do with how successful the sort of larger narrative arc of the right wing uh, ex- narrative about liberals, which is, I mean, a lot of their appeal is less, conservatives are so great. No, it's that those liberals are evil and scary, and they're constantly drumming up fear of liberalism, fear of scary leftists, Antifa and BLM, and it's all these things that they generate fear around, which is of course always induces an authoritarian response. When you generate fear, that's well, people psychologically respond as they start searching for anchors of security, which the authoritarian leaders offer. And but that's a lot of how the strategy of doing all this is involved in that. But
Mm-hmm.
but one of the things that happens, of course, is that those liberals who are being targeted, they they fight back by using facts and logic and reason, which is not what this is about. This is never about facts and logic and reason. This is about these gut level narratives, and so they don't actually deal with the very gut level narratives. They think it's not worth their time. It's such a it's so obviously a crazy theory that Democrats are involved in this global pedophilia ring that they don't actually bother to try to confront the people who believe this about them, to say, really, you believe that I'm part of a global conspiracy theory to suck the blood out of children? This is what you're telling me. If you can confront the people who are doing this like that, if they're people, especially if they're people or people who've known you, then that's the kind of gut level narrative that I think liberals need to adopt, is to say, hey, wait, we're not these evil people that you guys are creating. We are not these demons that these nutballs on the right have been concocting for the last 30 years. That's not who we are. Antifa is a tiny little entity, and it's not the demonized the communist and
Well,
nefarious
and Antifa,
existential threat
yeah,
that
and then
is. BLM is not a racist hate organization, which is what these people on the right have been telling you.
mhm.
These are the kinds of things that liberals do a really shitty job of confronting. Instead, they try to confront with logic and reason, and instead they should be going for, hey, let's be decent, basic human beings sort of approach when you're talking to these people. Are you really telling me, for instance, that this elementary school teacher is conspiring to suck the blood out of children?
Yeah.
Seriously?
Yeah. Well, they lost.
They don't do that.
No, they don't, and they've lost interest in debate. They've lost interest in getting into the trenches,
Right,
and
right.
and they have this unreal assessment of what people will be willing to believe. So they think, as you said, that they think that if you just present the facts, that people will choose the facts, but that's not human nature, and it never has been.
Never has been, unfortunately.
And and they also, at the same time, there's this to go back to this institution, this fetishization of institutions, and they don't realize that institutions were created. They weren't sort of handed down from on high, these miraculous things, and and Barack Obama and other people, they were fond of using this quote from Martin Luther King about how there was the moral arc of the universe inexorably bends toward justice.
Right.
But then they ignored all the other parts of Martin Luther King talking about how the civil rights was integrated with all of these other causes, and that in fact on the day that he died, Martin Luther King was actually going to a union protest.
Yes.
To help some workers. That's right. And so they just have this sort of cut rate version of history, and they don't understand how change happened, and they basically sort of think that it's permanent. I mean, the reality is that there is no moral arc of the universe. There is politics, and politics belongs to the people who work the hardest.
Well, especially when you have fascist elements and when you enable and allow fascist elements to fester and prosper, because fascist elements are profoundly anti-democratic, and they challenge and attack those democratic institutions in every corner. And we've been in total denial about the existence of these neo-fascist elements in our society, and we've been in total denial about the need to defend our democratic institutions from them, because they are under attack. These guys are attacking. They're attacking women's rights. They're attacking gay and lesbian rights. They're attacking normal minority civil rights. They're attacking, and ultimately, they're attacking the First Amendment rights of anybody to believe what they want. I mean, when you see Proud Boys walking around with shirts commemorating Pinochet throwing communists out of helicopters, that's pretty clear that they just want free speech for me, but none for thee. And not only that, not free speech for me, but if you dare counter me, I'm going to throw you out of a freaking helicopter. That's what they're saying. And that's their belief, because this is undeniably, a neo-fascist moment that America is enduring. And we need to wake up to that reality and confront it and deal with it in a way that works. We have to figure out what works.
Yeah. Well, and it's a really uncomfortable realization.
Yeah.
To have that, to realize that that's what's at stake. But I mean, for me, so like I for people who know my work, I started off in Republican politics and conservative media, but I myself was isolated from these viewpoints. I did not see them in my daily life, and I didn't interact with them. And but then as I became more aware of them, I had the realization that, oh my God, these people, they are insane, and they hate democracy, and they want Christian Sharia, basically, that this is what they want, and this is why they hate Islam so much, because they have all the same ideas as the radical Islamists, but they just want to put a different label on them. They want their label on them. And once I had
Yeah.
that realization, I realized I walked away from hundreds of thousands of dollars a year that I was making in that environment, and started trying to warn people about what was going on. But the Democratic establishment and a lot of the media establishment around the time that I did that. So a few months later, Donald Trump came along, and they really pushed this narrative that, oh, look at what Trump turned the Republicans into. Look at what he did, because it's an easier to understand narrative, but it also absolves
Absolve them.
them,
Yeah,
because they themselves were part of
absolutely.
this problem by elevating a lot of these very same people who went on to become his chief enablers, and like Rudy Giuliani. I mean,
That's
Rudy Giuliani has been a demented drunk for decades, but nobody had the guts to finally say anything about him until just very recently.
yeah, yeah. I know. Well, that's how it works. But you're 1,000% correct, sir. That's exactly what's happened. And there are days when I despair for democracy. Today's one of them. When after seeing what the Supreme Court's done, uh, but um, but I'm not going to stop fighting, and I don't think anybody else is either. I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of. I just hope Americans, awaken to the realization of what's happening to them in enough time to do something about it. I mean, basically, we have this November to
Hmm.
more or less decide our fate.
Yeah.
So, um,
Well, and the other thing also, though, is that there is a paradox, though, with some of these court rulings that we're now seeing overturned, whether it's Roe versus Wade, or
mm,
Bowers versus Hardwick on sexual private sexual autonomy, and Planned Parenthood versus Casey with birth control. So the paradox is that these rulings, they they were going along with what the public wanted. So the public did want to have people allow it was because, again, like, people, it's you would talk about how people have forgotten about how things were, but, like, it was literally the case that engaging in any type of sodomy, whether same sex or straight, was illegal. And even if it was in your own home, and it didn't and no one else was there or involved with it, it was a crime. And this was an outrageous thing that was the case. And it was an outrageous thing that you couldn't buy birth control. And it was an outrageous thing that, if you were of African ancestry, you couldn't attend the same school as other people. So
yes,
these were things that the public didn't want, at the national level, but they were never fully implemented through the democratic system. So
right.
they weren't voted on by representatives or by the public. And so those discussions that were just being had, and this was something actually that Ruth Bader Ginsburg talked about before she died, with regard to Roe versus Wade, that she thought that it was too expansive as a decision, and that it should have been more limited and allowed this discussion to happen. Because if it had, then it would have had more durability, in the same way that, so for instance, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, people are not out there. There of course are percentage of racist activists who want to get rid of that, but there isn't any sort of mass movement like there was against Roe versus Wade, or like there was
Yeah,
against same-sex marriage. And so
right.
these conversations, they were kind of cut off preemptively by an earlier Supreme Court. But now they should have happened, and now they're going to have to happen. Basically, is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, yeah. It's probably so. Um, if we can have them. I mean, my concern is that right now, I think conversation with people on the right is so fraught because Right now, if you disagree with them, they get their guns out,
Oh yeah, well,
threaten,
I'm not
threaten
even
to shoot
talking
you.
about with them. I'm saying that there's a lot of people in sort of the,
Oh,
you've got tens of millions of people in the United States who are not registered to vote, tens of millions
yeah,
who are registered but do not vote, and they just don't care because they don't think that there's anything at stake. Because as far as
right.
they're concerned, they don't feel like there is anything at stake, and like that's, and you could argue that that's a fault of neoliberalism for not delivering on healthcare or not delivering on greater worker rights and things like that. You can certainly make that argument, and I would agree, I'd be sympathetic to it. But at the same time, it
I,
is also the case that people haven't tried to talk to them and find out what do they want.
yeah,
And when you don't talk to the people and try to be responsive to them, then you do have this fake populism, this fascistic simulacrum of populism that Donald Trump is offering. If that's the
yeah.
only thing that's offering, some people will go along with it.
Well, I also would not want to underplay the really powerful role that right-wing media has played in this. The right-wing corporate media has played in changing the discourse, changing the shape of the discourse, so that these perceptions become more widespread. I mean, what can you do to change people who believe that Trump was cheated out of the presidency? Uh, you could say, well, show me your evidence, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to them
Mm-hmm.
uh, because they become so conditioned to believing this narrative that's coming from these authoritarian sources for them. That
Mm-hmm.
that's the only thing that shapes their worldview, and that those authoritarian sources are having a really powerful effect on how we talk about abortion, how we talk about civil rights, how we talk about. Um, I mean, how can you talk to people who believe that? I mean, one of the things that I think is fundamental to the whole abortion rights issue is because I have, very conservative Catholic friends and family members who don't believe abortion is right for them, but some believe that's okay to push on to then in code and law, and others don't. And to me, that's the fundamental argument that a lot of liberals have trouble formulating, is that, well, sure, you can believe that abortion is murder, but that's a religious belief. And there are millions of Americans who don't share that religious belief. And you don't have the right to force that religious belief on those millions who don't. Uh, I mean, even if you're sympathetic to that worldview, then why? What gives you the right to force others to obey that edict, even though it's just your personal religious belief? And honestly, the way the country was set up, I don't think you do have that right. But the minority has forced that on us now. So,
Yeah. Well, so tell us about what your research you're working on now with about some of these sheriff movements that you're working on. Tell us about that
oh,
as we wrap up here.
sure. Well, I think one of the things that we've all been, I think, concerned about, those of us who monitor the radical right, has been the way that um, law enforcement has become radicalized, or at least we've had a lot of extremism seep into the ranks of law enforcement. We certainly saw it during the 4 years that I was covering the Proud Boys events on the West Coast. We were seeing all kinds of, the police were clearly saw the Proud Boys and Three Percenters and the militiamen as their allies in these demonstrations. And that really came to roost the summer of 2020 during the George Floyd riots, that really became manifest, because it wasn't just anti-fascists that they were enabling this violence against. It was, people who were protesting police accountability, or police brutality. Um, and demanding police accountability. And so um, one of the main fonts of this extremism and radicalization in the ranks of law enforcement has been um, the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, this so-called constitutional sheriffs movement. And this especially affects rural America because they've had significant success getting constitutional sheriffs elected all over the country in various rural districts. We've got 4 or 5 of them here in Washington State, including a guy down in Clickitat County who basically thumbed his nose at the state law and allowed people in his county to hunt and shoot cougars, an endangered species. And another guy down in Oregon who, basically these guys all run their counties like personal fiefdoms. And so it's really a sort of authoritarian system. But now we're finding that they are also, these were examples of how, you can think it's just this single rural county that has this problem, but these sheriffs actually have a really wide effect on how states and the federal government are able to enforce their laws. And this guy with in Clickitat County was a classic example of that, with the way he affected the state's ability to, defend its wildlife policies. But now we're seeing that there was a guy in Michigan who Talking Points Memo recently reported, Dar Leaf, he's one of these constitutional sheriffs in Michigan, who has gotten involved in the supposed voting integrity thing. He tried to take some Dominion voting machines and seize them and then have them taken apart and examined. And he's doing all this with the blessing of the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, which is also encouraging sheriffs around the country to get involved in the issue of voting integrity, as they call it, and basically try to seize voting machines. So you can see that it's not just going to affect these rural counties. It's going to affect maybe the whole country.
Well, and it's also part of their idea of this a larger principle that a lot of it is linked to their extreme religious views as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so going back to, and honestly, that's probably an entire longer conversation, but basically this is bubbling up from the bottom in Republican politics and having much bigger influence, not just in the local level, but also in state parties. And that's why you did see a lot of these people trying to work with Trump on his election fraud schemes, and now they're extending this idea, in terms of like Secretary of State candidates. So you had a number of them that are now saying that they would have no problem with throwing away the votes of the public.
Right, and now you're recruiting law enforcement to do it.
That's right.
Encouraging law enforcement to do it.
Yeah.
I will say I've been spending a lot more time dealing recently with the sustained and concentrated attack on the LGBTQ community from the extreme right. I was present in Coeur d'Alene at their Pride event when I got a lot of photos of Patriot Front guys being arrested out there on that lawn, and but I was there all day to observe what was going on, and it wasn't just Patriot Front that was planning to invade that event. It was all day long. There are guys with AR-15s walking around the fringe of the crowd, white nationalists showing up with banners that said "Groomers are not welcome in Idaho." And some of the guys with guns actually were walking into the middle of the crowd and, threatening. They didn't say anything, but just their presence was pretty threatening. And this event had been really targeted by the radical right for about a month and a half. And we're seeing it now also with Proud Boys attacking LGBTQ events. Particularly they've been going after
Hmm.
drag queens. So there was a group of them down in Arlington, Texas, who actually went to a drag queen event, a brunch that was being held there in Arlington. That was, in fact, it was for people 21 and above. There were no children involved, and yet these guys, these Proud Boys, invaded the event anyway and harassed the customers inside. Um, so they're doing their neo-fascist brown shirt street tug thing,
Hmm.
which is, that was the function that brown shirts had
Yeah.
in 1920s Germany, and the Proud Boys are replicating that function in American streets today.
Yep.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, that's true.
So extremists are really coalescing around a variety of fronts, but I'm particularly concerned about the growing presence of these street thug elements and how the violence that they're bringing into the political equation when your politics are, um, especially the way they're attacking school boards and local
Hmm.
entities, city councils, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
These are the nitty gritty levels of democracy that, I came up through small town papers, and so I know that this is more in a lot of ways the foundations of democracy is the ability of these local entities to function well
Yeah.
and for democratic values to be sustained through them. And when they're under attack, then I think that we really need to pay attention.
Yeah.
Um, and and so we're facing a lot of fronts, and we need to take them seriously.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I think, maybe something that for even if you're not progressive, or so you're a centrist, or
Hmm.
moderately conservative, you need to understand that these people will come for you also.
Yep.
And we're seeing that at the local level a lot, where they're coming after school boards who are members who are just doing their jobs, not trying to be political, not trying to be controversial. They're coming after election officials. They will come after anyone that they think can be useful to attack. And so
They wanted
you
to.
need
They wanted to hang Mike Pence.
that's right. Yeah. So if you don't have to, you can even agree with, let's say, a lot of what they want, but that won't be sufficient. And Mike Pence
Yeah.
is the great example of that.
Yeah.
And on these different state level election officials in Georgia and Arizona,
Yeah.
that's they will come for you, and it's time for you, if you need to set aside your differences with people on the left and realize that they at least want you to have the ability to advocate for what you believe in, whereas the people on the radical right do not. They want to have a theocratic fascist state, and they will
Where
do
they control
anything.
everything. Yeah.
Yeah, and they will
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
anything to get to that point. And
Yeah.
so people need to understand that you cannot compromise with these people. Fascism cannot be bottled without it exploding on the person doing it.
Yeah.
So,
That's right. Well, I just think about. I mean, there was some account recently that gays against growers that bubbled up on Twitter, and I'm sure that there are people in the sort of right-leaning LGBTQ community who think, oh yeah, well, I'm all for gay rights, but we don't want to have anything to do with these drag queen story hours and kink at pride parades, things like that, because that's really bad. Um, and what they don't understand is, I spent a lot of time monitoring people on the extremist right, listening to what they're saying, and documenting it. And the past couple of months, I've come across a whole deluge of fundamentalist preachers talking about how they want the death penalty for gays, for all gays, and their rationale for it is that they are all pedophiles. Every gay person is either a pedophile already or they are a pedophile in waiting. And this is their belief. So it doesn't matter if you go against your fellow gays and say, oh, well, we don't want to do that, because, and actually join in the narrative. If you support the narrative that these fascists are pushing, if you indicate support for them in any shape, form, or fashion, you're just throwing logs on the fire that they're going to throw you onto eventually.
Yeah.
And that's just the reality.
Yeah. No, that's right. It's 100% right. All right. Well, this has been a informative discussion. I appreciate you taking the time to be here today, David. So let me just put up on the screen your Twitter profile. So David Neiwert is at DAVIDNEIWERT on Twitter. And then you are also at dailycoast.com. That's KOS on the end. And if you could just stick around a little bit here after I wrap up the show, that'd be great. Thanks for being here. Okay, cool.
My pleasure.
All right. Okay, so that is the program for today. And wanted to remind everybody that we need your support to keep doing shows like this and to keep producing in-depth articles and podcasts about right-wing radicalism. So please go to patreon.com/discoverflux. And then if you want to get up with our show archives and past episodes, just go to theoryofchange.show. And then that will take you to the flux.community website, where you will be able to see lots of other good things as well. And please let us know what you're doing. If you've got a podcast, you've got articles, or you're blogging somewhere, we need to join forces here at this critical time as much as we can. So please do let us know what you're doing, and let us know what you're interested in talking about as well. So hope to see you guys next week. My name is Matthew Sheffield, and I will see you next time.